Someone get this librarian off my mat before she breaks a nail. The words, dripping with a thick, syrupy arrogance, echoed off the cavernous ceiling of the Fort Bragg Combatives facility. The crowd laughed. It wasn't a roar of genuine amusement, but a low, nervous rumble of complicity from the nearly 800 soldiers of the 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, assembled for their mandatory quarterly training. They were a sea of identical gray T-shirts and black shorts, a vast organism of disciplined muscle and bone. And for a moment, they moved as one, their collective gaze falling upon the two figures at the center of the sprawling blue mat. One was the source of the insult, Staff Sergeant Marcus Thorne, the lead instructor. He was a monument to his own philosophy of force, a man carved from granite and ego, with a barrel chest and arms like knotted ropes. His voice was a permanent bark, honed by years of shouting over the din of machine guns and rotor wash. The other figure, the target of his derision, was Sergeant Eva Rostova. She offered no reaction. Her face, framed by a severe, practical bun of mousy brown hair, remained a placid mask. She didn't flinch, didn't scowl, didn't even meet his condescending smirk. Instead, her gaze was distant, her focus seemingly turned inward, as if she were methodically cataloging the dust motes dancing in the shafts of morning light that pierced the high windows. But when the battalion commander, Colonel Jennings, saw her stance from his position near the back wall, a flicker of something ancient and knowing passed through his eyes. He saw not a librarian, but a foundation, a human being rooted to the very core of the earth, her weight distributed with a geometric perfection that was anything but accidental. If you believe that true strength is measured not in the volume of the voice, but in the precision of the soul, type competence below. The air in the facility was thick with the familiar sense of military life. The sharp tang of sweat, the faint aroma of weapons oil clinging to the air like a ghost, and the sterile, rubbery smell of the training mats themselves. It was a cathedral of controlled violence, a place where soldiers were systematically broken down and rebuilt into something harder, faster, more lethal. Banners hung from the steel rafters, each one bearing the name of a battle a world away. Mogadishu, Kandahar, Fallujah. They were solemn reminders of the stakes, a visual history of the blood and sacrifice that consecrated this ground. It was on this sacred ground that Staff Sergeant Thorne had built his reputation. He was, in the parlance of the infantry, a true believer. He believed in overwhelming force. He believed that aggression was a virtue and that hesitation was a sin. His lessons were loud, brutal, and simple, favoring powerful, bone-jarring strikes and overpowering grappling. To him, combat was a matter of physics. The larger mass moving at a higher velocity would always win. He saw the world through this simplistic, brutalist lens, and he judged everyone by it. When he had called for a volunteer to demonstrate a basic defensive technique, his eyes had scanned the assembled soldiers and landed, with predatory delight, on Sergeant Rostova. She was an anomaly. In a battalion of hardened operators, she was assigned to the S1 shop, the administrative heart of the unit. She was known for the quiet efficiency with which she processed leave forms and personnel files, for the neat precision of her handwriting, for the silence that always seemed to accompany her. She was slender, almost delicate in appearance, and the standard-issue physical training uniform seemed to hang off her frame. To Thorne, she was the perfect foil, a living, breathing example of everything a warrior was not. He saw her as a soft target, an easy mark to demonstrate his own superiority and reinforce his philosophy of might. His decision to call her out was not just a training choice. It was a public declaration of his worldview. The battalion felt it. The nervous laughter that had rippled through the ranks was the sound of young soldiers aligning themselves with power, siding with the loud, confident voice of authority against the quiet, unassuming outlier. It was a primal, instinctual response, a way of saying, "I am with the strong one. I am not the nail that stands up." They watched as Rostova moved from the edge of the formation toward the center of the mat. Her walk was not a march, it was a glide. There was no wasted motion, no theatrical swagger, just a smooth, efficient transfer of weight from one foot to the next. Her arms remained loose at her sides, her hands unclenched. She stopped precisely 3 feet from Thorn, a distance that was both respectful and tactically sound, and waited. Her silence was a vacuum, and Thorn, a man who abhorred a vacuum, rushed to fill it with more words. "All right, Sergeant," he boomed, his voice bouncing off the walls. "The scenario is simple. I'm a bad guy. Big, mean, angry. You are. You." More chuckles from the crowd. "I'm going to throw a simple, telegraphed right hook. Your job, according to the book," he said, tapping his temple with a thick finger, "is to execute a basic parry and create distance. Think you can handle that? Don't worry, I'll go slow. Wouldn't want you to chip a nail on my granite-like jaw." The insult was layered, designed not just to mock her, but to infantilize her, to reduce her from a fellow non-commissioned officer to a fragile doll. He was performing for the crowd, playing the part of the magnanimous, all-powerful instructor, and they were eating it up. Rostova's response was a single, barely perceptible nod. Her eyes, a pale, indeterminate shade of gray, finally lifted to meet his. But they didn't focus on his face. They seemed to look through him, cataloging the subtle tells of his body. The way his right shoulder was tensed just a fraction higher than his left. The slight forward lean of his weight onto the balls of his feet. The almost imperceptible twitch in his pectoral muscle as his brain sent the first signals to initiate the punch. She saw not a man, but a collection of levers and fulcrums, a machine of bone and sinew preparing to execute a flawed, inefficient movement. She remained still, a statue of calm in the swirling vortex of Thorn's ego. The silence stretched, becoming heavier, more charged with every passing second. The entire battalion held its collective breath, a massive audience waiting for the curtain to rise on a play whose ending they thought they already knew. They were about to witness a lesson, a demonstration of power. And they were right. They just had the roles of teacher and student completely, catastrophically wrong. The anticipation in the vast training hall had reached a fever pitch, a palpable entity that seemed to press in on all sides. For the soldiers of the 3rd Battalion, this was more than just a training exercise. It was theater. It was a reaffirmation of the established order, a public spectacle reinforcing the comforting belief that strength looked a certain way, that power spoke with a certain voice. Staff Sergeant Thorn was the embodiment of that belief, and he was about to prove it once more. He savored the moment, basking in the attention of hundreds of his peers and subordinates. He cracked his neck, a loud, popping sound that was part of his ritual, a deliberate auditory signal of impending action. He widened his stance, settling into a clumsy approximation of a boxer's crouch that sacrificed stability for the appearance of aggression. "Ready, librarian?" he sneered, the final barb in a long chain of insults. "Here it comes." "Don't blink," he began his attack. It was exactly as he had promised. A slow, telegraphed right hook, an arm moving in a wide, inefficient arc. It was a punch designed not to land, but to intimidate, to force a flinch, a panicked retreat that he could then exploit. He was playing with his food. He wanted to see the fear in her eyes, the moment of realization that she was out of her depth. He wanted her to stumble backward, to confirm for everyone present that she did not belong on his mat. He wanted to prove his assumptions correct. He watched for the flicker of panic, for the frantic backpedaling, for the clumsy raising of her arms in a desperate, untrained block. He saw none of it. In the sliver of a second it took for his fist to travel from his shoulder into the space she occupied, Sergeant Rostova did not retreat. She did not block. She did not even seem to move in the conventional sense. Instead, she flowed. As his fist, a meaty projectile of bone and ego, approached her head, she executed a movement of such sublime economy that it was almost invisible to the untrained eye. She didn't step back. She pivoted. Her left foot remained planted, the anchor point of a perfect circle, while her right foot slid backward and to the side, a fraction of an inch, just enough to shift her center line out of the punch's trajectory. His fist, aimed at her jaw, now sliced through empty air, its momentum unchecked, its energy wasted. The force of his own missed punch pulled him forward, unbalancing him, his body a clumsy pendulum now swinging past its point of equilibrium. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, a brief window where his forward momentum had stripped him of his foundation. And it was in that exact window, in that nanosecond of instability, that Rostova struck. Her movement was not an attack in the way Thorne understood the word. It was a correction. It was a response, a precise and logical answer to the physical question his lunge had posed. As his body twisted past her, she dropped her weight, her center of gravity sinking toward the floor. Her right leg, which had moved back to facilitate the pivot, now snapped forward. It was not a high, theatrical kick aimed at the head or torso. It was low, fast, and brutally efficient, aimed at the one point that was bearing his entire unbalanced weight, the outside of his left knee. Her foot, encased in a standard-issue army running shoe, was not a blunt instrument but a surgical tool. The blade of her foot connected with the side of his knee at the exact apex of his forward momentum. She was not fighting his strength. She was borrowing it, redirecting it, and returning it to him with catastrophic interest. The sound was not a single, clean crack. It was a sickening, complex symphony of destruction. There was a wet, tearing pop as his anterior cruciate ligament, the primary stabilizer of the knee, shredded like rotten rope. This was followed by a deeper, grinding crunch as the cartilage between his femur and tibia disintegrated under the impossible sideways pressure. Finally, there was a sharp, percussive snap as the joint hyperextended and dislocated with violent force. The entire, horrific sequence took less time than a single heartbeat. The result was instantaneous and absolute. Staff Sergeant Thorne, the monument of a man, the preacher of overwhelming force, crumpled, his leg folded inward at an angle nature had never intended. A strangled gasp, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock and agony, was ripped from his throat. He fell to the mat, not like a felled tree, but like a marionette whose strings had been abruptly cut, a heap of disconnected limbs and shattered pride. The thud of his body hitting the rubber mat was the only sound in the cavernous hall. It was a dull, final punctuation mark at the end of a sentence no one had expected to hear. For a long, suspended moment, there was nothing. No cheers, no gas, no vespers. Just a profound, deafening silence. The 800 soldiers of the battalion, who moments before had been a chorus of nervous laughter, were now a silent congregation of stunned disbelief. They stared, their minds struggling to process the impossible image before them. The giant laid low, the instructor writhing in agony, the quiet librarian standing perfectly still, her breathing even, her expression unchanged. She hadn't even broken a sweat. Her hands were still unclenched at her sides. She had executed a feat of impossible violence with the serene, detached calm of a chess master capturing a pawn. The arrogance that had filled the room like a toxic gas had vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp vacuum of awe and fear. In that silence, every assumption that had been made in the last 5 minutes, assumptions about gender, about size, about job titles, about the nature of strength itself, was shattered as completely and irrevocably as Marcus Thorne's knee. The play was over. The lesson had been delivered. But it was not the lesson anyone had come to see. The silence that followed the fall of Staff Sergeant Thorne was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered all other sensations. It was a silence born of pure shock, a collective cognitive dissonance that had seized 800 minds at once. The image on the mat was a paradox. The source of the loudest voice was now silent save for ragged, pain-filled breaths, while the quietest person in the room stood as a pillar of absolute stillness, her very presence now screaming a truth more powerful than any shouted insult. Soldiers stared, their faces a gallery of slack-jawed astonishment. They had witnessed not a fight, but a physical refutation. It was as if Rostova had reached out and, with one precise, economical movement edited the reality they had all agreed upon. The world had tilted on its axis. The natural order of things, big beats small, loud beats quiet, force beats finesse, had been violently, undeniably inverted. On the mat, Thorn was attempting to push himself up, his face a contorted mask of agony and confusion. His bravado had evaporated, boiled away by the white-hot flash of pain. He looked at his leg, bent at a grotesque, unnatural angle, and a wave of nausea and disbelief washed over him. His mind, accustomed to a simple, linear world of cause and effect, could not build a bridge between the slender woman standing calmly a few feet away and the catastrophic ruin of his knee. It was impossible. It was magic. It was a nightmare. Then, a new movement broke the spell. From the back of the formation, a figure began to move forward. The sea of gray shirts parted for him without a word, a silent, instinctual act of deference. It was Colonel Jennings, the battalion commander. He was a man in his late 40s, lean and wiry, with a face that looked like it had been carved from old leather by years of exposure to sun, wind, and the hardships of command. His eyes, a piercing blue, missed nothing. He had seen more combat than almost anyone in the room, and he carried with him an aura of quiet, unshakable authority that had been earned in the dusty streets of forgotten wars. He hadn't been laughing. He had been observing, his gaze fixed on Rostova from the moment Thorn had called her out. He had seen the subtle perfection of her posture, the preternatural calm in her eyes, and a memory had been stirred, a ghost from a past life in a much darker corner of the military world. He walked not to Thorn, but directly toward Rostova, his boots making no sound on the soft mats. The battalion medics, who had started to rush forward, froze in place, waiting for his command. Jennings stopped in front of Rostova, his eyes not accusatory, but filled with a deep, penetrating curiosity. He looked from her placid face down to the wreckage of Staff Sergeant Thorn, and then back again. "Sergeant," he said, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the thick silence. It was not a question, but a statement of recognition. That was a system had arrived, knee destruction, wasn't it? A specific counter to a committed haymaker. They don't teach that in the standard Army Combatives Manual. Rostova met his gaze for the first time. There was no defiance, no pride, just a simple, professional acknowledgement. "No, sir," she said. Her voice was soft, yet it carried across the silent hall with perfect clarity. "They do not." Colonel Jennings nodded slowly, a small, grim smile touching his lips. The final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the hundreds of stunned faces before him. He saw the confusion, the shock, the dawning respect. He knew this was a teaching moment, one that would be remembered long after the pain in Thorn's knee had faded. He then looked toward his battalion sergeant major, a grizzled veteran standing near the edge of the mat with a tablet in his hand. "Sergeant Major," Jennings commanded, his voice now ringing with authority. "Pull up Sergeant Rostova's official personnel file. The classified addendums as well. Read her qualifications. Out loud. For the entire battalion to hear." The sergeant major, a man rarely surprised by anything, blinked once. He tapped on a screen, his fingers flying across the virtual keyboard. A moment later, his eyes widened. He cleared his throat, his own voice tinged with a newfound respect that bordered on awe. He began to read. "Sergeant Eva Rostova, primary military occupational specialty, 42A, human resources specialist." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. This was the librarian they knew. Then the sergeant major continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Secondary MOS, 18Z, Special Forces Senior Sergeant." The murmur died instantly, replaced by a sharp, collective intake of breath. The silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. "Combat déploiement, 6. Locations classified certifications." The sergeant major continued, his voice now like a judge reading a verdict. "Master Instructor, Modern Army Combatives Program, Level 4. Graduate, Special Operations Close Quarters Combat Course, awarded Distinguished Honor Graduate. Instructor, High-Threat Environment Protective Services, Department of State. Certified instructor in 5 forms of open hand and edged weapon martial arts, including Systema and Krav Maga. The list went on. A relentless, staccato fusillade of credentials, each one a hammer blow against the foundation of their prejudice. He read of language qualifications, advanced marksmanship awards, commendations for valor from operations whose names they had never even heard. With every word, the image of the quiet paper pusher from the S. One shop was being systematically dismantled and replaced by something else entirely, something far more formidable and far more dangerous than Staff Sergeant Thorne could ever have imagined in his worst nightmares. The sergeant major finished reading and looked up, his own expression one of complete recalibration. The file didn't just list qualifications. It painted a portrait of a quiet professional, a warrior who moved through the shadows of the military's most elite echelons, her true nature hidden behind a mask of administrative normalcy. The librarian was a ghost. The final qualification read by the sergeant major hung in the air like the resonant echo of a struck bell, a sound that vibrated in the very bones of every soldier present. The revelation was total. Sergeant Eva Rostova was not an administrator who happened to be good at fighting. She was a master of combat who happened to be working, for reasons of her own or of the Army's, in an administrative role. Her current posting was the camouflage, not the reality. The quiet, unassuming woman from the S1 shop was, in fact, one of the most highly trained and lethal individuals in the entire battalion, if not on the entire post. Colonel Jennings let the weight of that truth settle over his soldiers. He watched their faces change, saw the gears of understanding and recalibration turning behind their eyes. The looks of shock were slowly being replaced by something else, a deep, profound, and humbling respect. He had their complete and undivided attention. He turned back to Rostova, who had remained impassive throughout the public reading of her own legend. She stood as if she were listening to a weather report, her expression giving away nothing. To her, these were just facts on a page, a history of her professional life, no more worthy of an emotional response than a list of supply requisitions. Jennings paused, then executed the most powerful gesture in the military lexicon. He brought his hand up in a slow, precise, and perfectly formal salute. It was not the casual salute an officer gives a subordinate. It was a gesture of profound professional respect, a recognition from one warrior to another, rendered in front of the entire command. "Sergeant Rostova," he said, his voice filled with a sincerity that left no room for doubt. "My apologies. On behalf of the battalion, we should have had you teaching this class from the beginning." Rostova, in turn, returned the salute with the same crisp, economic precision she applied to everything else. "Thank you, sir," she replied. It was a simple, direct acknowledgement, devoid of any hint of triumph or vindication. The exchange was a silent, powerful lesson in leadership and humility. The colonel had publicly admitted a failure in his command awareness, and, in doing so, had validated Rostova's status beyond any question. He had corrected the institutional error and, by extension, shamed the ignorant prejudice that had caused it. He then turned his attention to the wider audience, his voice taking on the tone of a commander addressing his troops on the eve of battle. "Let this be a lesson for every single one of you," he began, his gaze sweeping across the formation. "Look around you. The soldier standing next to you is more than the uniform they wear or the job title on their record. They're the sum of their experiences, their training, and their character. Assumptions," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense growl, "are a cancer. Assumptions get you killed. Assumptions make you underestimate your enemy. And assumptions," he said, his eyes flicking for a moment to the medics now cautiously attending to Staff Sergeant Thorne, "make you disrespect your allies." He let that sink in. Staff Sergeant Thorne made an assumption based on what he saw. He saw a female sergeant from an administrative section, and he judged her. He allowed his perception to overwrite reality. He failed to see the professional standing in front of him. He saw a librarian, not a warrior, and he has paid a painful but valuable price for that failure. His words were not just a reprimand. They were a diagnosis of a cultural sickness. The arrogance, the casual sexism, the belief that strength came in only one shape and size. It was all part of the disease. Today, they had all witnessed the cure. Sergeant Rostova, Jennings continued, embodies the very ideal of the quiet professional. Her skills do not require advertisement. Her competence does not need a bullhorn. She proves her worth not with her words, but with her actions. That is the standard to which every ranger in this battalion will be held. Do you understand me? A thunderous, unified chorus of "Yes, sir," erupted from the soldiers, a sound that was part apology, part affirmation, and part pure, unadulterated awe. The spell of the morning's casual disrespect was broken, and a new, more profound order had been established. The lesson was over. The colonel gave a sharp nod to the medics, who quickly and efficiently stabilized Thorne's leg and loaded him onto a stretcher. As they carried him away, his face pale and his eyes glazed with a mixture of morphine and humiliation, he looked over at Rostova one last time. There was no anger in his gaze anymore, only a dawning, agonizing comprehension. He had not been defeated by a person. He had been defeated by a principle. He had charged headfirst into a fortress of quiet competence, and he had been broken against its walls. The soldiers began to disperse, but not before casting one last glance at the woman at the center of the mat. She was no longer just Sergeant Rostova from S1. She was a legend in the making, a living embodiment of a powerful truth. They now saw her not for her unassuming appearance, but for the depth of skill it concealed. They had learned that the most dangerous weapon in the room is not always the one that makes the most noise. Sometimes it is the one that says nothing at all, waiting with perfect, patient calm for you to make your first and last mistake. The story of what happened in the combatives' hall that morning did not just spread, it detonated. It moved through the barracks and chow halls of Fort Bragg like a shockwave, traveling at the speed of gossip and awe. Within hours, every soldier in the 3rd Battalion knew. By the end of the day, the entire 75th Ranger Regiment had heard the tale. By the end of the week, it had breached containment, filtering into the wider special operations community through phone calls, text messages, and posts on secure forums. The narrative was honed and polished with each retelling, the details becoming more mythic, more legendary. It was no longer just a story about a training accident. It became a parable, a foundational myth for a new generation of soldiers. They called it the Rostova Pivot, or the day the librarian broke the giant. The story always began the same way, with Staff Sergeant Thorne's arrogant, dismissive quote, "Someone get this librarian off my mat before she breaks a nail." That line became the essential setup, the perfect encapsulation of the ignorance that was about to be so utterly demolished. Then came the description of the action, often embellished with hyperlocal details. Some said they heard the pop of Thorne's ligaments from the back of the room. Others swore they saw a flicker of blue energy arc from her foot to his knee. The description of the silence that followed, however, was always consistent. It was described as absolute, a perfect, reverent vacuum in which an entire battalion's worth of prejudice had been suffocated. The reading of her file became the story's climax, a litany of impossible credentials that served as the final, stunning reveal. The tale became a teaching tool. Platoon sergeants told it to their new privates as a warning against arrogance. Officers used it as an example of the importance of knowing your personnel. It became a shorthand for the concept of the quiet professional. To be a Rostova meant to be underestimated but overwhelmingly competent. To pull a Thorne became a new slang term for making a catastrophic, ego-driven mistake based on a bad assumption. The antagonist of the story, Staff Sergeant Thorne, underwent a transformation that was almost as profound as Rostova's revelation. The 6 weeks he spent in a full-leg cast and the subsequent months of painful physical therapy gave him something he had never had before: time for quiet reflection. Stripped of his physical prowess, the foundation of his identity, he was forced to confront the flawed architecture of his own beliefs. The pain in his knee was a constant, throbbing reminder of his hubris. He replayed the moment of his downfall 1,000 times in his mind, not with anger, but with a kind of clinical fascination. He saw his own sloppy telegraph punch, his arrogant overextension, his complete lack of respect for his opponent. And he saw her response. The perfect pivot, the sublime economy of motion, the absolute certainty of the result. He realized she had not been trying to hurt him. She had simply been solving a physics problem he had created. He was not the victim of an attack. He was the author of his own destruction. When he was finally cleared for light duty, Akane, his new, humbling companion, the first thing he did was seek out Sergeant Rostova. He found her where she was always found, in the quiet, orderly world of the S1 shop, processing paperwork with the same focused calm she had displayed on the mat. He stood before her desk, leaning heavily on his cane, and for the first time in his life, he felt small. "Sergeant," he began, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual bluster. I came to apologize. For my conduct in the training hall. For my words. There was no excuse for it. I was unprofessional. I was wrong." Rostova looked up from her computer screen. Her gray eyes held no malice, no triumph, no pity. They were simply observant. She studied him for a moment, then gave a single, slow nod. "Apology accepted, Staff Sergeant," she said. "Focus on your recovery." It was all she said, but it was enough. It was a clean, professional absolution. Thorn, however, was not finished. "I have a question," he said, his voice earnest. "If you would." She gestured for him to continue. "That technique," he said, "the pivot, the counter. After it happened, I looked it up. I've been studying. I want to understand." A flicker of something, perhaps interest, perhaps approval, appeared in Rostova's eyes. "Understanding is good," she said. "It's the foundation of technique. Would you be willing to teach me?" he asked, the words costing him the last vestiges of his old pride. "When I'm healed. I want to learn how to do it right." Rostova considered his request for a long moment. She saw not the arrogant instructor from that morning, but a humbled soldier genuinely seeking knowledge. "The battalion is rewriting the combatives program," she said matter-of-factly. "Colonel Jennings has asked me to lead the redesign. The first class for new instructors is in 3 months. If you're medically clear by then, you are welcome to attend." She then turned back to her work. The conversation concluded. For Thorn, it was a lifeline. It was a chance not just to heal his body, but to rebuild his entire professional philosophy from the ground up, this time on a foundation of respect and genuine competence. Meanwhile, Rostova, now a reluctant celebrity, deflected all praise with her characteristic minimalism. When a young ranger stopped her and told her she was a legend, she simply replied, "I am a sergeant." When asked how she had defeated such a larger opponent, she said, "He provided the energy. I just provided the direction." She began to hold informal training sessions after duty hours, and they were always packed. She taught her philosophy of quiet competence, emphasizing that leverage, timing, and technique were always superior to brute force. She mentored soldiers who, like her, didn't fit the stereotypical warrior mold, teaching them how to turn their perceived weaknesses into strengths. A symbolic artifact of the events soon appeared. On the wall of the combatives hall, directly above the spot on the mat where Thorn had fallen, someone had taped a small, laminated nameplate. It simply read, "Rostova." It wasn't an official monument, but it was more powerful. It was a landmark, a physical reminder of the day that assumptions were shattered and a new standard of professionalism was set. It was the place where silence had spoken its irrefutable truth. A year passed. The seasons changed at Fort Bragg, the humid summer giving way to a mild autumn, then a crisp winter, and returning to the vibrant green of a North Carolina spring. Within the 3rd Battalion, the changes were even more profound. The legend of the Rostova pivot had become institutionalized, evolving from a piece of gossip into a core component of the unit's identity. The combatives program, once a bastion of brute force aggression, had been completely overhauled. Under Sergeant Rostova's quiet, methodical leadership, it had been transformed into a sophisticated system that prioritized de-escalation, control, and surgical efficiency. The new doctrine was built on her core philosophy. Use the minimum force necessary to neutralize a threat, and use an opponent's momentum as a weapon against them. The results were undeniable. Training injuries, which had been a chronic issue under the old program, plummeted by over 80%. At the same time, during evaluations and joint exercises, the battalion's hand-to-hand combat proficiency scores soared. The Rangers of the 3rd Battalion moved with a new kind of confidence, one born not of arrogance, but of a deep, technical understanding of their craft. They were quieter, more observant, more precise. They had learned from Rostova that true power did not need to advertise itself. The most visible symbol of this change was Staff Sergeant Thorne. His recovery had been long and arduous, but he had attacked his physical therapy with the zeal of a convert. He was the first to sign up for Rostova's instructor course, and, throughout the grueling weeks of training, he was her most dedicated student. He had shed his old skin of arrogance, replacing it with a quiet, intense humility. He asked more questions than anyone else. He stayed late to practice the subtle shifts in weight and the precise angles of leverage. He was no longer trying to overpower his opponents. He was trying to understand them. Now, he stood as Rostova's lead assistant instructor. His body was healed, though he walked with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, a permanent reminder of the lesson he had learned. He was a better teacher than he had ever been before, because he now taught from a place of earned wisdom rather than assumed superiority. He often used himself as an example. "I once believed that being bigger and stronger was all that mattered," he would tell the new soldiers. "I was a fool. I learned the hard way that the most powerful muscle is the one between your ears. I learned that respect is a tactical advantage. Never, ever underestimate anyone." His personal testimony, delivered with raw, humbling honesty, was more impactful than any training manual. The story was now told to every new soldier on their first day of combatives training. It was part of the official curriculum. They would be gathered on the blue mats, and Thorne himself would point to the laminated nameplate on the wall. He would tell them the story of the loud staff sergeant and the quiet librarian. He told it not to shame himself, but to inoculate them against the disease of prejudice that had once infected him. He made sure they understood that the hero of the story was not the one who executed the technique, but the principle the technique represented, the triumph of quiet competence over loud assumption. The legacy of that day was not just a new training program. It was a cultural shift. The battalion became known for its professionalism, its lack of bluster, its quiet lethality. The Rostova standard became the benchmark. Colonel Jennings, in his farewell speech before his next assignment, spoke of it directly. "The single most important event that occurred during my command of this battalion did not happen on a battlefield in some foreign land," he told the assembled formation. "It happened right here, on these mats. It was the day we were all reminded that a warrior's heart is not measured by the size of their frame, and a warrior's value is not measured by the volume of their voice. Sergeant Rostova taught us that strength is quiet. Strength is precise. Strength is humble. That is the legacy of this command. Carry it with you." Sergeant Rostova herself remained unchanged by her fame. She eventually rotated out of the S1 shop and took on a full-time role at the Regimental Training Center, where she continued to refine and teach her methods. She remained quiet, professional, and utterly devoid of ego. She saw her contribution not as a personal victory, but as a necessary system upgrade, a correction to a flawed piece of code in the institutional operating system. Her actions had created a ripple effect, a positive feedback loop of respect and competence that would continue to spread long after she was gone. She had proven that a single act, rooted in deep mastery and quiet confidence, could be more powerful than 1,000 shouted orders. She had not left behind a statue or a medal. She had left behind standard. And that was a legacy that would never fade. The story of Sergeant Eva Rostova and Staff Sergeant Marcus Thorne is more than just an anecdote from a military training exercise. It is a timeless parable about the fundamental nature of worth and the deceptive allure of appearances. It speaks to a deep, universal truth, that true strength is rarely loud, and true competence needs no introduction. It is a force that exists quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment of testing to reveal its undeniable power. Legacy, as this story teaches us, is not a monument you build to yourself. It is not found in the echo of your own voice or the reflection of your own image. True legacy is the standard you set, the quiet ripple of influence that continues to expand long after you have left the room. It is the positive change you inspire in others, the flawed assumptions you dismantle, the better way of thinking and acting that you leave in your wake. Rostova's legacy was not the shattered knee of an arrogant man. That was merely the catalyst. Her true legacy was in the transformed mindset of a battalion, in the safer and more effective training that saved lives, in the humbling of an ego and the elevation of a principle. It lived in every soldier who learned to look past the surface, to judge a comrade by the content of their character and the quality of their work, not by their gender, size, or job description. It is the quiet professional in every field of human endeavor who forms the bedrock of our world. They are the surgeon whose steady hands are guided by decades of silent study, not by a desire for praise. They are the engineer who finds the single, critical flaw in a complex system through patient, methodical analysis, not through loud pronouncements. They are the teacher who quietly inspires a generation of students, seeing the potential that others overlook. These are the people who move the world forward, not with bluster and self-promotion, but with the relentless, undeniable force of their demonstrated skill. They operate on a simple, powerful principle. The work speaks for itself. Their silence is not a weakness. It is a fortress. It is the calm at the center of the storm, a place of deep confidence that requires no external validation. They do not waste energy on convincing others of their worth. They focus that energy on mastering their craft. And when the moment of truth arrives, when the crisis is at hand and the stakes are at their highest, their actions speak with a clarity and finality that no empty boast can ever match. We live in a world that often mistakes volume for value, that rewards the loudest voice in the room, that celebrates confidence even when it is unearned and baseless. We are drawn to the spectacle of arrogance, sometimes forgetting to look for the quiet, steady hum of true competence that powers everything of lasting worth. The story of Sergeant Rostova is a vital and necessary reminder to look deeper. It urges us to challenge our own assumptions, to question the superficial judgments we make every day. It asks us to seek out and respect the quiet professionals among us, to learn from their discipline, their humility, and their unwavering commitment to excellence. For it is in their example that we find the true blueprint for success, not just on the training mat or the battlefield, but in the grand, complex project of building a better, more just, and more effective world. True power is not the ability to shout down your critics. It is the ability to render their criticism irrelevant through the sheer, undeniable force of your competence. For more stories where precision triumphs over prejudice and where quiet competence defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.